So Daniel and I are back to continue talking about some of these really interesting topics. Today we're going to talk about emotional intelligence, inclusion, and respect. So Daniel Goleman is a psychologist who came up with these 5 components of emotional intelligence. And they are self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. Self-awareness is just being aware of your emotions in the moment.
Yep.
So knowing what you're feeling and maybe kind of why you're feeling it. Emotional self-regulation is really just the ability to manage strong emotions. It's not squelching your emotions. We know it's important to feel our emotions, but sometimes if we don't manage our emotions, we might say or do something we later regret. I can certainly think of times I have done that. Motivation is this idea that we all need to have intrinsic internal motivation. Motivation that comes from within. So we are motivated to achieve our goals because we want to do that for ourselves, not because of money or recognition or to please somebody else. Empathy, everyone kind of, I think, knows what empathy is, but it's the idea to really try to understand someone else's emotional place and emotional feelings, to really get in there and say, I see you, I hear you, and I understand how you're feeling. And then finally, social skills are just the ability to interact with others, not just in social settings, but in the workplace, in the classroom, in any setting we go into, that ability to navigate the emotions in the room and kind of try to have the social skills that get you through those situations. So Daniel Goleman, who kind of captured these ideas, has stated that emotional intelligence makes a bigger difference in the workplace and in our lives than IQ, than just your basic intelligence quotient, because it's your emotional intelligence that really sets you apart from others in the workplace. And I think the idea of emotional intelligence ties in really nicely to some of these other topics as well. So I'm wondering, Daniel, if you can touch on the role that emotional intelligence plays with our own personal stereotypes and biases.
Yeah, and I love emotional intelligence, and even to Dr. Goleman's his research, what he did a lot of times was study CEOs, and he said, well, CEOs kind of have the prowess from a leadership standpoint, from a intelligence standpoint, from proven record all the way through an organization in some instances. If they are on paper look like great leaders, what prevents them from actually being great leaders? Because we can probably all agree that all leaders aren't great leaders.
Absolutely.
And it is this notion of emotional intelligence. Now, how it relates to kind of our own biases and stereotypes, well, again, I'll back up and talk about the brain itself. First of all, we have them. We have stereotypes, we have biases, and fortunately and or unfortunately, we'll always have them in one way, shape, form, or fashion. The reason I say that is because our brain categorizes information. It makes associations, it makes these pathways, and the goal of this is so our brain can maintain efficiency as much as possible. And so if our brain is constantly having to reassociate and live in this constant state of daily change and all these things, then we really won't have the wherewithal to set goals or to think beyond the right now. And so our brain kind of makes these categorizations, many of which are unconscious, as are the majority of our brain processes are unconscious or implicit processes. And so we have these stereotypes and biases that we develop. Again, we develop them for individuals, we develop them for groups, we develop them for situations, for environments, for places, for all different types of things. We have the categories. So right now, if I say restaurant, you're going to think of a lot of things. You're going to think of tables or booths. You're going to think of a drink. You're going to think of a particular restaurant, food. You're going to think of a lot of things that are associated with a restaurant. If I say playground, same thing. You'll kind of have this mental image of what a playground is. And so one of the things that often encourage people to do is don't try to suppress those stereotypes, especially, or those biases, especially when they come up. If they're exposed one way or another, whether it's something you've heard or an experience that was different. So if I say restaurant and there is a completely different layout or format for a restaurant, then that's a part of a bias. We don't necessarily call it that. It would, in that sense, be more of a categorization, but that's kind of the stereotype that we have that is directly counteracted by something that's different. And so whenever we are faced with a stereotype or a bias that we may have, don't run from it, right? And that comes from being able to understand yourself, that self-awareness that you just mentioned, and then the regulation. So there are times where, especially when we're dealing with people, where those biases or whatever may creep up, and we start to feel guilty about them, we start to feel angry, or we start to feel a particular way, particularly speaking for like negative biases, we start to feel a particular way, and a lot of times we try to suppress it. Well, you have to learn how to manage, become aware of it, and then manage it, as you mentioned a minute ago. And then that will enable us to have interactions with other people. Because now we start to understand, okay, so if someone tells me of an experience that they had, I may not get it. I don't know what it's like to be a woman in the workplace, but if a woman tells me about it, then I need to have the wherewithal to try to understand and empathize and have those skills to navigate that experience. So it really is all about trying to become aware and in tune with yourself before you can actually learn and manage a relationship with someone else.
I love how you said that, because I think so often the message we get is, it's bad to stereotype. It's bad to have biases. And we know that it is. And yet, what you're saying is it's a very natural thing. That's how our brains work. The key is the emotional intelligence piece, not necessarily acting on it or buying into it, but processing it, managing it, and empathizing.
Yeah, I heard Irsha Manji, who is she's a speaker, and one of the things that she said in a presentation that she did here in town once was you should use labels as starting points and not ending judgments. Because we can't get away from the categories in which we associate things. We cannot. That's how our brains operate. But when we only operate based off of our stereotypes and biases and own assumptions, and especially when something comes to counteract that or contradict it, and we still want to operate, that's where the issues come in. And unfortunately, we kind of see that in society now, where we have these categorizations and something that comes that may not fit that box, and then we kind of at ends with another person because we can understand why they're not fitting that box, and we can understand why that person wants us to fit in that box.
Yeah. Oh, I think absolutely. I think that's what happens with stereotypes too, is it just kind of takes away the role of the individual.
Right.
Everyone's the same, and we know that's not true.
Right.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, thank you.
Of course.
I have another question for you. So, with the topics of inclusion and respect, how can all of us do better at OTC and in our lives?
Yeah, that is a $1 million question. And honestly, I do believe it starts with the individual. We have to understand and kind of come to terms with that we don't know what we don't know. However, we cannot let that stifle our motivation and our ability to learn the things that we don't know. And so just as a formal educational setting is intended to do, it's intended to teach us things that we don't know, to measure where we are, and then to measure our progress. It's the same concept when we're talking about inclusion and respecting someone else and valuing them, and frankly, valuing the dignity that they bring as another human being, regardless of the differences. And so learning how to engage someone else in a relationship is important. We have to learn how to engage ourselves first. We have to learn how to regulate, become aware, understand ourselves, and then we can kind of consciously navigate cross-cultural differences and value the inclusion of diversity, which a lot of those become buzzwords when we kind of zoom out, but it really is just human nature. And so when you don't know something, lead with curiosity, lead with openness, lead with a form of objectivity. Don't try to impose your opinion or your perspective just because. And even I teach a class, and as an instructor, I try my best to lessen that power or perceived power gap between myself and my students, because I want them to know I'm not perfect, and I'm going to learn from them. Maybe not as much as they'll learn from me, but I'm going to learn from them as well. So it's being put in a position of, some would say, cultural humility, and just trying to seek out those different perspectives.
I think that's really powerful, and I agree. I mean, I don't think I would still be doing this all these years later if I didn't learn something from my students all the time as well. And that being open, being fair-minded. I love it. You said cultural humility. Can you touch on that a little more? Yeah,
cultural humility is basically, it talks about how there really is not one culture. And particularly from the humility part, just to say my culture is not the end-all be-all culture. It's not, to me, it's the best culture. To others, there are certain elements of my culture that might be the best, whether we talk about group identity or maybe I think extroverts are the best, or I'm personally biased towards psychology. I mean, all those I can find similarities to in culture. But in psychology, if I discount the power of fields like sociology and anthropology and some of the other subfields of psychology as a whole and just other fields, if I'm minimizing the culture and the perspectives that they bring, then I'm not being culturally humble. I'm thinking that mine is the absolute supreme being, which, okay, maybe it is. But I mean, seriously though, I mean that's kind of the basic premise behind culture and humility.
I really, that really makes a lot of sense, and you miss out if you aren't open
really
to that.
Do.
You miss out.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing some time, and
you.
I hope you all learned as much as I did. Thanks.
Awesome.